All right, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. We're here today with Dr. James Anderson. We're going to talk about God and logic. What's the relation here? What's the relation between God and logic? Is there any? Is there any reason to think that logic itself might sort of indicate or point toward the existence of God? We're going to explore that. Dr. Anderson, you're a new guest to the show, so it's great to have you. Thanks for being here, and really looking forward to this.
Well, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah, so if you don't mind, we'll just start with a little bit of background. Who's Dr. Anderson, and how did he get to be doing all this stuff that you're currently doing?
Yeah, so this is Dr. Anderson.
Right there.
Yeah, right here. So I'm from the United Kingdom originally. You can probably tell from my accent. But
Thought I'd pick that up.
Yeah,
a little twang there. Yep.
Yeah, England and then Scotland for a number of years. And then moved to the United States in 2009 to teach at Reformed Theological Seminary in Charlotte, North Carolina. I teach classes on some theology, philosophy, Christian apologetics, ethics, a range of stuff, and do a bit of writing, research in my spare time. And yeah, that's what I do.
Yeah, I read your paper, the one we're going to be talking about, the Law of Non-Contradiction, a while ago, and I remember just being fascinated by it and thinking I need to reach out to Dr. Anderson, and I totally failed. I never did. And then I became reacquainted with your work because of your blog, because we did on the podcast, we did Simulation Hypothesis Week, and you've got a number of blogs on the simulation hypothesis. So I was reading your stuff, and I was like, oh yeah, this is Dr. James Anderson, the guy who wrote that paper I wanted to talk about. So
right,
that's how this all came together. But don't worry, we don't have to talk about the simulation hypothesis on this. You're probably tired of talking about it at this point.
No, actually, I don't talk about it a lot. I did one other podcast about it, and it's not really an area of specialty for me. But I kept getting these emails from people saying, "Oh, all these really smart guys like Elon Musk are saying that we're living in the Matrix. How can I answer that? Is there a good reason?" So I wrote a little article and then a follow-up article just explaining why I don't think you need to worry about that.
Right. Yeah, it's good. I'll link that in the show notes in case anybody wants to read that. But let's focus on the primary topic today. So I read your paper a while ago. Of course, most of it dropped out of my memory, and I tried to quickly refresh myself before the episode, as I typically do. So what is this argument? Maybe give us the general contours, and then we can explore some of the details as we move along.
Okay, so this is what we call the argument for God from logic. Now, of course, logic is something that most of us take for granted. Philosophers trade in arguments using logic. You can get textbooks on formal logic, what are the laws of logic, and so forth. And so there's a sense in which any argument for God's existence is going to make use of logic. It's got to be a logical argument. If it isn't a logical argument, it isn't a good argument. But this argument is doing something a little deeper. It's asking, what are the laws of logic themselves? What kind of things must the laws of logic be in order to play the role that we take them to play? So in a sense, it's a metaphysical examination of the laws of logic themselves, rather than just assuming them, but asking some metaphysical questions about the status of the laws of logic. And then as this investigation proceeds, we can actually show that if there are laws of logic, and if they have the kind of properties that they need to have, then they would depend on the existence of God. Now, that may not seem obvious. In fact, it probably doesn't seem obvious. But as you start to unfold the argument, step by step, basically what it comes down to is arguing that the laws of logic are ultimately divine thoughts. That is, they are thoughts, eternal, necessary thoughts in the mind of God. And there would be no other metaphysical account that would satisfy the sort of criteria that we need.
Yeah, great overview. How would you compare and contrast this argument, say, with the traditional argument from eternal truths, or some of the more contemporary arguments that scholastic realists make from universals and propositions and possible worlds to a sort of, scholastic realism position?
Right. Yeah. So there have been in the past arguments from the existence of truth to the existence of God. And in a sense, this is a version of that argument. But I think it's a more rigorous, up-to-date version, in that it's not reliant on scholastic metaphysics, which can be a little abstruse. I'm not knocking it, but this argument is conducted with the language, the terminology, the framework of contemporary analytic philosophy.
Right. So you would say compatible with that, but doesn't rely on that scholastic metaphysical
I mean,
background.
I think
Right.
it would be consistent. You might say it would reinforce some of the more medieval arguments from truth to God. And actually, the core idea of the argument that truths are ultimately divine thoughts, that you can go back to Augustine. You can find that in Augustine. He makes that sort of argument.
Okay, so there's obviously a number of steps in the argument here. Some I think would be very unreasonable to challenge. So maybe you can help us work through it and maybe focus on some of the more controversial steps,
right?
So we make the best use of our time, right?
Yeah. So there are a series of steps, and as you say, some are really beyond reasonable dispute. Or if someone's going to question them, then we're not really going to make any headway. Others are where the things get more controversial, and some of these steps are doing the heavy lifting in the argument. Right. So the first step would be to recognize that the laws of logic are truths. Okay, so what we mean by that is that they are true propositions. So take the law of non-contradiction. The law of non-contradiction says that no statement can be both true and false at the same time and in the same sense. Okay, that would be a summary of the law of non-contradiction. Basically, you can't have a proposition that's both true and false. That law of non-contradiction is itself a truth. Right? It's making a statement about statements, and it's a statement that we take to be true. If the law of non-contradiction isn't true itself, then why do we pay any attention to it? And you can say the same for other laws of logic, that they express truths about other things, which leads to the next step, that the laws of logic are truths about truths. Okay, most of our statements, if they're true, they're about other things. So we might say the sky is blue. Okay, so that's true, but it's not. It's about something else. It's about the sky. Right. But the laws of logic are actually truths about truths. There are truths about the truth relationships between propositions, that they have to have certain truth values rather than others. So the laws of logic are truths, and they are truths about truths. And a truth is itself a what we call a true proposition. Propositions in contemporary philosophy are defined as truth bearers. So a proposition is just something that can be both true and false. So either if something is true, then it's either a proposition or it contains a proposition. Like you can have a belief that's true, you can have a statement that's true. The thing that is true is what we call a proposition. Okay, so the laws of logic are true propositions about truths. Next step, and again, I don't think this is controversial, is that the laws of logic are necessary truths. That is, that they are not only true, but they could not fail to be true. They could not have been false. Some truths are contingent truths, like James Anderson exists. Okay, that's true, but it didn't have to be true. It's not a necessary truth, because I might not have existed. My parents might never have met, So James Anderson exists is a contingent truth. But the laws of logic, like no statement can be both true and false, and other laws of logic, we take them to be necessary truths. Another way to put it is that they are true in every possible world. Right. So James Anderson exists is true in this world, but there are possible worlds in which I don't exist. But there's no possible world in which a contradiction can be true. And there are other categories of what we call necessary truths, like mathematical truths. 2 + 2 = 4. There's no possible world in which 2 + 2 = 5. 2 + 2 = 4 necessarily. And the laws of logic are like that. So laws of logic are necessarily true propositions. Okay, now the next step is where things get a little bit more controversial, but I think there are good arguments here. And that is that the laws of logic are real entities. The laws of logic really exist. And we can make a general argument for the existence of propositions. And insofar as laws of logic are a particular category of propositions, we can argue that the laws of logic exist. And there are different kinds of arguments for what is called realism about propositions, but some of them are quite simple. Like there's an ordinary language argument, which says, if we can say there are X's for some X kind of thing,
Yeah.
that implies the existence of X's. So if someone says there are trees, that implies or presupposes the real existence of trees.
Right, as the truth maker, right? You brought up truth bearers before, and now we...
Yeah,
Right.
well, it's really what we call an ontological commitment. Certain
Yeah.
certain claims that we make commit us to the existence of certain entities. So if I were to say, Joe Biden is a man, right? That presupposes the existence of Joe Biden. Okay, there's an ontological commitment there, at least on the face of it. We could get into some exceptions like fictional statements, but we say there are laws of logic. Okay, there are laws of logic. We can talk about them. We can identify them. Law of non-contradiction, the law of excluded middle. There are books written about the laws of logic. So on the face of it, there are laws of logic is a true statement. And unless we have good reason to deny that it's actually making an existential statement about laws of logic, we should take it that there are laws of logic.
Yes.
That's just one kind of argument. There are other kinds of argument. For example, we have a certain intuition that something can only make a difference in the world if it exists, right? Non-existent things can't affect us, can't have any sway over us, can't make a difference in the world.
Right.
Clearly, the laws of logic make a difference, right? I mean, we want to pay attention to them. We want to observe them. And so if something has to have some reality or some existence in order to make a difference in the world, then the laws of logic must exist. They must be real. Now, they're not, as we'll get to later, they're not physical things. They're not material things. They are what we would categorize as abstract entities or immaterial entities, if they exist. But again, if the laws of logic are actually make a difference in the world, are things that we should observe, should in some sense submit to, then they must be real things. One other argument I'll throw out is the argument from property attribution. And the argument is that if we say that something has a property, then that thing must exist in order to have that property. So if I were to say that the Statue of Liberty is tall, okay, I'm attributing a property to something, the Statue of Liberty. To say that the Statue of Liberty is tall can only be true if the Statue of Liberty exists. Okay, non-existent things can't bear properties. Propositions are things that bear properties, specifically truth or falsehood. Truth and falsehood are properties that we ascribe to propositions in general and to the laws of logic. We said earlier, laws of logic are truths. So if we say that the law of non-contradiction is true, then that commits us to the existence of the law of non-contradiction, because non-existent things can't bear properties like truth or falsehood. So that's a selection of arguments that philosophers have given for realism about propositions, and we can apply those kind of arguments to the laws of logic. So to come back to the step in the argument, we're now arguing that the laws of logic really exist. They are really real entities. Again, they're not physical things, but they are something that have real existence. Now, maybe we should pause there. I don't know, take stock.
Yeah, let's take some stock. This is great. I love you're just laying it all out. This is fantastic. Now, obviously, I maintain that realist posture, but have you gotten any? And it's a posture that's sort of broadly assumed. So I would not take that as one of the more controversial steps in your argument. Is there any, I guess, any escape hatches there you've seen people try to wiggle through at that point that you think are worth addressing or sealing off?
Yeah. So, of course, any philosophical position has its controversies, has its pushbacks, its objections, and this is no exception. And, committing yourself to the existence of propositions isn't uncontroversial. there are different moves that people can make here. It seems to me that the general tendency in contemporary metaphysics is towards some sort of realism about propositions, although there are attempts to identify them with human thoughts or something related to human minds. We'll see the problems with that in just a moment. But there is the nominalist tradition that wants to say that everything that exists is concrete and perhaps even material in nature. So anyone who's a materialist, who wants to who thinks there are good reasons to affirm a materialist view that everything reduces to material stuff, whether that's physical particles, energy, whatever, they're going to be very resistant to an argument for realism about propositions. And so they're going to push back on things like they'll say, well, just because we say there are such and such, that doesn't mean that we're actually committed to that thing in general. They'll come up with counterexamples like there are things that we don't know. Okay, there are things that we don't know. Does that commit us to the existence of some category called things we don't know? There's some group of things out there that we don't know. Well, maybe it does, or maybe it doesn't. But there are other sort of there are statements that someone could push back on and say, well, we say that, but it doesn't commit us to the existence of something in particular. Likewise, fictional statements. So if I were to say Sherlock Holmes lives in Baker Street, okay, does that commit me to the existence of Sherlock Holmes? Well, clearly not. Unless, I mean, there are some weird metaphysical views that say that fictional entities actually have some real existence, but we don't need to go there. We can just grant for the sake of argument that Sherlock Holmes doesn't actually exist. But we do have a way of understanding that. That is that there is some sort of fictional world or fictional scenario, specifically the great stories of Arthur Conan Doyle. And within those stories, within that narrative, that would be a true statement. So we're sort of assuming, actually, you could say we're assuming a possible world, the possible world that Conan Doyle has identified for us, in which there's this character, Sherlock Holmes. So within that framework, we're sort of relativizing that statement to a particular framework. The problem is we don't treat the laws of logic like that. Okay, you can't say the laws of logic are like Sherlock Holmes because, well, first of all, Sherlock Holmes actually isn't making a difference in the world. The stories of Sherlock Holmes might be, but Sherlock Holmes as a human being is not making a difference in the world, certainly not in the way that the laws of logic are, in the way that we're bound to them. But the other thing is that if, fictional entities, we can change. We can come up with them. Conan Doyle, invented this character, Sherlock Holmes. He could have made him 5'11". He could have made him 5'4". He could have made him brown-haired, blue-haired.
Could have not made him at all, right?
Exactly, right. Any fictional thing could never have been conceived in the first place. But the laws of logic, again, are not like that. They are what they are, regardless of what they think about them. We didn't come up with them. No one invented them. If someone did invent them, then we could just change them. Or we could invent our own version of the laws of logic. But clearly we don't do that, because when we read textbooks about the laws of logic, there's some agreement that these things are objective. They're universal. They apply to everyone. If they're there at all, then they're there in some objective way. They're not fictional entities. So, there are different moves to try and get out of the argument for the existence of these, but I don't think any of them work in the end, because the kind of counterexamples that people come up with don't fit the profile of the laws of logic and, more generally, what we call propositions, these things that we deal with that are true or false.
Yeah, and we haven't even covered all the issues with nominalism, including that it seems to be notoriously self-defeating.
Sure.
And certainly I think a realist could, if we're going back to the scholastic realists, at least, they would hold to modes of being, right? So we could handle things like Sherlock Holmes and stuff. He has a particular mode of being. It's not like our mode of being, but he still has a mode of being, right? Okay, so very good. I'm satisfied with that. I'm just trying to cover some of our bases there. So let's keep moving.
So there's some argument required for that step. Okay, so let's assume now we've granted that the laws of logic really exist. They are true propositions, and they have some real existence. Okay, we haven't settled yet what kind of things they are. That's going to come later. We're just saying.
Oh, we did say they're at least not. They don't have a physical mode of existence.
Okay, we did. All right.
So maybe we should talk about that. And is that would you say because they have a very determinate, unambiguous character where any physical thing is always going to be open to multiple ways of being interpreted and represented. It's always you see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there are different ways of drawing out the point that propositions in general and laws of logic specifically can't be physical things. One reason is that physical things, in the nature of the case, exist in space and time. They have a spatial location. They typically have an extension, some sort of size or dimension, and they pass through time. But the laws of logic aren't like that. Mm-hmm. The law of non-contradiction doesn't have a location. You can't hunt it down and trap it and put it in a museum or something. I mean, wouldn't that be a great thing? Oh, the British Museum is holding the law of non-contradiction.
Right.
You'll see it. So laws of logic, if they exist, they can't be physical things. But I think the really compelling argument here is that once we recognize that the laws of logic are necessary truths and they exist, it follows that they necessarily exist. And the argument is this: if the laws of logic are necessarily true, then they are true in every possible world. Mm-hmm. If they're true in every possible world, then they must exist in every possible world, because something can only have the property of truth if it exists. So once we recognize that the laws of logic are necessary truths, that they are true in every possible world, in other words, no matter how things were, no matter how things could be, the laws of logic will still be true. Mm-hmm. That means that they must also necessarily exist. So some of the arguments that we use for the existence of the laws of logic now become arguments for the necessary existence of law of logic. Mm-hmm. And I think this is actually true more generally of any necessary truth. Any proposition that is true in every possible world must also exist in every possible world in order to bear that property of truth. Mm-hmm. So now we've established that the laws of logic not only exist, but they exist necessarily. They could not have failed to exist simply because they could not have failed to be true, to bear that property of truth. But of course, physical things don't exist necessarily. Mm-hmm. At least you'd have some difficulty arguing that any physical thing could exist necessarily, because every physical thing that we know of exists contingently, whether it's the table that's in front of me right now, or the book, or the planet Neptune. All of these things, although they exist, didn't have to exist. They might not have existed. Right. And that seems to be true of physical reality in general, that any physical thing could exist, but also it might not have existed. It didn't have to exist. So if the laws of logic have necessary existence, then they can't be physical things.
Yes.
And that means that we can't identify laws of logic with linguistic inscriptions, like statements on a page, writing on a page. We can't identify them with brain structures, neurons, nothing like that. No physical thing could be a law of logic, or could be the metaphysical ground of a law of logic, if a law of logic exists necessarily. Okay.
Right. Yeah. So, good. Mm-hmm.
So we're starting to put the pieces together now. Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, the next step is I think the really interesting one, and I would suggest that this is probably the most controversial point of the argument. In other words, it's the point that I think most philosophers who understand this kind of argument are going to push back on hardest. Mm-hmm. And it is that the laws of logic are thoughts. That is, they are mental entities. They're mental in nature. And again, we make this argument from the nature of propositions. Okay, one of the basic properties of propositions is that they are what we call intentional. Mm-hmm. Intentionality is what we call aboutness, right? So propositions are about things. So take the proposition that Paris is beautiful in the spring. Okay, so that's a proposition. Let's say it's a true proposition. It's about something. It's about Paris, right? And so propositions have this property of being directed towards other things. Mm-hmm. They are about other things. They have this directedness that we call technically intentionality. So propositions have intentionality, and they have it at a most basic level. It's an essential feature of propositions. Now, what kind of things in the ontology that we already accept have intentionality? Physical things don't have intrinsic intentionality. A physical thing in and of itself isn't about anything. So right. In the parking lot outside my office, there are cracks in the parking lot. That crack in the parking lot isn't about anything. It isn't directed towards anything. It's just a physical structure. Mm-hmm. Now, physical structures like writing on a page can have intentionality, but it's derived from mental activity.
Right. So sort of borrowed intentionality.
Exactly.
Right,
derived intentionality. Mm-hmm. So any physical inscription that has intentionality has to have some thought behind it. It only has intentionality derivative of some thought. Right. And thoughts are, as it were, the archetypal intentional entities. Mm-hmm. Because that's what a mind does. A mind directs its attention towards things. I can think about Paris. I can direct my thoughts to Paris. I can direct my thoughts to San Francisco. I can direct my thoughts to the moon. I can direct my thoughts to a squirrel running up the tree. That's one of the basic features of mental entities, thoughts, ideas, beliefs. These are intentional by nature. And so the argument here is that we already have an ontological category of things that have intentionality. They're thoughts. And so if we're going to assimilate propositions to some ontological category that we already have, it's not going to be physical or material things. It's going to be thoughts.
Yes. Uh-huh.
Now, someone could argue, well, we can add a third category. We can add a third category. Propositions sit in this extra. Then they're neither thoughts nor material things. They're some sort of platonic,
just new category, yeah.
Right. They're a sort of de novo, sui generis category of abstract platonic entities. Mm-hmm. And some philosophers will actually want to go that way. They're going to want to pull out the Platonism card and say that there's this third realm of abstract entities that are mind-independent abstracta.
Yeah.
Now, there are a number of issues with that, but one of the first arguments we're going to make is...
I just had to say, whenever you've got somebody pulling out the Platonist card, I always feel like a point's been scored. You know what I mean?
Think so, yeah.
I always, especially when it comes to these type of worldview debates, as soon as the naturalist starts dipping into Plato's back pocket, okay, maybe. Yeah. But can we at least acknowledge? Yeah.
Certainly for a naturalist, that seems like it's a white flag. It's a surrendering some point, and certainly it's a cost. Philosophically, it's a cost because you're now adding a whole new ontological category. So here we're partly appealing to the principle of parsimony, or Occam's razor, as it's commonly called, that you shouldn't multiply entities beyond necessity. Mm-hmm. In this case, a category. If you can assimilate propositions to some ontological category that you already have, thoughts. I mean, no one can deny that there are thoughts, except some of these crazy eliminative materialists who want to deny that actually there are minds or thoughts or anything like that. Now, okay, they can. I take that as a reductio ad absurdum of materialism. But for those of us who, our minds haven't been corrupted by materialist philosophy, it's obvious that we have thoughts, we have minds. They're part of our common sense ontology already. So
they're ineliminable, right? Mm-hmm.
Right, exactly. That's right. And so if propositions have this feature that is arguably the distinctive feature of the mind, of mentality, what we call intentionality, then the simplest thing is to say that propositions, including the laws of logic, are mental items. They're mental in nature, they're thoughts. And actually some philosophers want to say that they are, when it comes to propositions, they are conceptualists, but they're human conceptualists in that they think that propositions are ultimately human thoughts.
Yes.
Now, that's good insofar as it recognizes that propositions really are mental items. They have mentality, they have intentionality. And so it's natural to try and assimilate them to some category of thoughts. Mm-hmm. The problem, as we've already seen, is that necessary truths, like the laws of logic, exist necessarily.
Yeah,
but no human thoughts exist necessarily, because human beings and human minds are contingent. So that's the problem with saying that propositions are human thoughts, or the thoughts of a finite contingent mind.
Right. We can't secure the necessity there.
Exactly.
And, you know, the more I've thought about just laws in general, it just seems like all laws have a thought-like structure.
Yeah.
Right? Not just the laws of logic. All laws have a thought-like structure, which of course is going to be compatible with where we're going, right? But
we could talk about the laws of physics, the laws of morality. All of these laws have some sort of propositional structure to them. They're not material things. They have intentionality, even though they're about different kinds of things. So we could make similar arguments. But what's important here is that the laws of logic have necessary truth.
Yes.
Some people think that the laws of physics are contingent truths. They could have been different. So they maybe wouldn't be so suitable for our purposes. But the laws of logic really are necessary truths. If they're necessarily true, then they exist necessarily. And therefore, if they are thoughts, and here we come to the conclusion of the argument after, it takes us a while to get here, but we can see where it's headed. They have to be necessarily existent thoughts. So we've argued the laws of logic exist, they have necessary existence, and they are mental in nature, they're thoughts. Therefore, they must be necessarily existent thoughts. Now, once you grant that, then you have to grant the existence of a necessary existence of a mind. They have to be thoughts. You can't have thoughts without a mind. Okay, thoughts are features of a mind. You can't have, mind-independent thoughts that just sort of float free of any particular mind. But whose mind are they going to be? Well, the mind of a necessarily existent being, which is just God. So once you grant, or once you see that you've been led to the necessary existence of a mind, some being with thoughts, with intellect, then you've basically conceded the existence of God.
Yes. Yeah. So I want to this is really cool, Dr. Anderson. I want to explore this. And in fact, again, it reminds me of the sort of general scholastic realism, right? Where, God's essence is being, and, intellect grasps being's first principles, that being is not being. And of course, God is an unrestricted act of understanding, and it just is sort of just all kind of falls out from there. But I want to stay within your paradigm and your terminology, and not bring in the scholastic system for this. I'm just seeing a compatibility here that I think is really cool, right? So before diving deeper and investigating the conclusion, do we want to go back to the Platonism thing and maybe say a few more things about the problem of trying to use that as because that does seem to me, if I were trying to get out of this argument, that I guess that's probably one of the moves I would try to make, try and veer off into Plato's heaven, right? So what else do we want to say about that?
Well, in a sense, the argument is like a competition between competing views of propositions, what we do with propositions, the laws of logic being a particular kind of proposition that are useful for our purposes. But there are different theories of propositions. There's the outright nominalist or anti-realist who wants to deny the existence of propositions altogether. We've seen some of the problems with that, because once you deny that there are propositions, you're denying that there are truths, that there really are such things as truths. And that's not a road that I think any philosopher who cares about truth wants to go down. Right. Then you've got the finite conceptualists, those who want to say that propositions are mental entities, they are thoughts, but they're human thoughts. They're either thought tokens or thought types. There's different ways of cashing that out, and that runs into the problem of the necessary existence, right? And also what's called the plenitude issue, which is that there are more propositions, there are more truths than any human mind or any collective of human minds could accommodate. Right. I mean, just think about mathematics, right? For every natural number, there are a host of truths about that number. For any number n, there's the truth that n times 2 is some other number. Right. So in principle,
so it seems like that landscape far outstrips what the limited conceptualist could possibly
right,
accommodate. Right. Yeah.
right. So I mean, theoretically, there are an infinite number of true propositions, only some of which we can grasp. Some are just too complex for any human mind to grasp. Some of them are just have never been contemplated by human minds. We never got around to thinking them. And yet, certainly on a theoretical level, in terms of mathematical theory and other areas, there are all these truths, all these true propositions that are there. That we can, by sort of inductive argument, we can see that there must be these truths.
Yeah.
But they couldn't be reduced to human thoughts. So another problem with the human conceptualism answer is that there are just too many truths for us to handle. That line, "you can't handle the truth," becomes
we can't
takes on a deeper meaning. And then you've got the Platonist option. So the Platonist is going to say, there are these three categories, at least three categories that we are ontological categories. There are material things, there are mental things like human minds, and there are this third category of Platonic entities. And they are out there. They're kind of like Plato's forms. But so they exist necessarily, they exist eternally. They're causally inert, so they don't change, they're immutable. You can't change them, they can't change you. They don't do anything.
They don't guide evolution, for example.
No, they wouldn't, because they, and here's the problem, they don't have any causal contact with the other realms.
Right. Yeah.
Plato's forms don't actually do anything. They don't cause any changes in the world. And the same would be true for these Platonic propositions.
Right.
They're out there, but the question is, how do we have access to them?
Yeah. How do you link up?
Yeah. If they're causally inert, then they can't affect us. We can't affect them. So what is the connection? What's the nature of the connection between the material world and our minds? That's the real question.
Yeah. And would you say for a naturalist, that's going to be an in-principle problem? Well, at least Plato had the demiurge, right?
Yeah. Although that was, of course, a fudge, because, the demiurge, if the demiurge is a material being, then you
how does he link up? Right. But at least he kind of saw the problem that we need something to account for the link, even though if he couldn't ultimately solve it, right? He recognized the problem, right? Yeah.
And that's why Plato says it's a likely story, right? He doesn't say this is the truth. He says this is about the closest we can get to the truth. So there's this demiurge that makes the link. And that's always going to be a problem for any Platonist, whether it's the ancient kind or the modern kind. What is the connection between this very different abstract realm of Platonic entities and the world that we actually live and breathe in and think it, and our minds are engaged in? And the beauty of the view that I'm defending, the divine conceptualist view, is that we already have a causal connection there. If truths are divine thoughts, then because God is a concrete entity with causal powers, and God is the creator of everything other than God, including both the physical realm and the mental, creaturely mental realm, we've already got that causal connection.
Yeah, okay? You can see how it can all easily be integrated, right?
Exactly. You've got an integrated worldview. You've got an integrated account within your various ontological categories. That doesn't mean
and it's far more parsimonious. We don't need the whole Platonic, the new category or the entire heaven, all that stuff, right?
Although I have found that some Platonists will push back and say, your theistic view is no more parsimonious because you've got God in your system, right? You've got not only human minds, you've got a divine mind as well. And while we would argue, well, there's this category of thoughts that would apply to human thoughts and divine thoughts. So we're just saying that propositions fall into this ontological category of thoughts. Some Platonists are going to say, oh, wait a minute, that's a bit of a cheat because divine thoughts are, in a sense, a completely different ontological category than human thoughts. And you've got this incredibly significant being in your system, God.
Yeah, we do.
Right. Which I see as, that's a feature. That's not a bug, right? I mean, actually, what I would say is this argument from the laws of logic is one that you would want to couple with other arguments. And the overall argument is that a theistic worldview gives you an account of a whole range of phenomena, including propositions, but other things as well. It's a sort of unifying explanation of things like why there are moral laws, why there is a purpose or direction, teleology in the universe. And, you know, we could go on and on.
Why there's any contingent thing at all.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. There's that terminating explanation as well.
Yeah. I haven't ever been super impressed with the objection that theists have more things until naturalists are really clear on what they mean by a natural thing to begin with. And of course, they're all over the board on this, right? So on some accounts, it seems like actually theism could count as a form of naturalism, right? And then I'm sure you're familiar with those accounts, right? And then on other accounts, it seems like, okay, even if I still have God, it's still far more parsimonious than the ontological mess that you have over here, right? At least on the fundamental level, in terms of theoretical simplicity and stuff like that. So,
and I found a lot of naturalists, and I don't want to generalize too much because I think the philosophically trained naturalists don't make this mistake, but a lot of sort of common or garden naturalists think that parsimony means that you just want less things in your ontology. So and they'll argue, well, naturalism is always going to be simpler than theism, because naturalism, you've just got the universe. Theism, you've got God plus the universe. But parsimony isn't about having the fewest number of things. If that were the case, then nihilists would be the winners who say nothing exists.
Right. And same with historians who deny the existence of Bill Clinton. That's one less thing.
Yeah, right. Exactly. But rather, parsimony says, what's the fewest number of things that you need to explain the things you have to explain? It's the simplest sufficient explanation. Right. And so our argument here is that naturalism doesn't have the ontological resources to account for things like propositions or laws of logic, but theism does. Right. And so while theism is more parsimonious than certainly theism plus a bunch of Platonic entities, and you can argue the toss with some sort of non-theistic Platonism, but when it comes to naturalism, I don't think there's really any contest here.
Yeah, no, I certainly agree. And those are good reminders, right? Simplicity is a consideration, a criteria. It's not the consideration, right? Explanatory power, scope, degree of ad hocness, all of that, right? And we're saying, well, look, no, even if this was a sort of extra thing, right? It's something we need anyways, right? So, but of course, I think we'd push back. I mean, there's different ways to think about simplicity too, right? There's syntactical simplicity or elegance. Well, it seems like theism easily wins there, right? With perfection or pure act or whatever, right? Different theists have different ways, but it seems like very easy in terms of superior in terms of syntactical simplicity, quantitative simplicity, at least again, if we think that simplicity matters most on the fundamental level, it's going to be hard to tie a theist there because we got one thing, right? Naturalists, I don't know, if you're a priority monist, maybe you could tie on that, but then I think you're always going to lose on qualitative simplicity, right? Because to compete with theism, you're always going to have to kind of build in more limits. You're going to have more information to describe that fundamental theory. So, all of which to say is I agree with you. Right? So, okay, so all right, so now let's dive into your, I guess the relation now between God and logic, or maybe one of the better ways to do this is to look at some other objections. So you had Alex Malpass, smart thinker. He's had an objection to your argument. So we should definitely consider it because he's obviously a reflective critic. So what is his objection and how do you think it helps to clarify your argument and how would you respond to that one?
Okay, so there have been a number of responses to the argument, which is, of course, very gratifying when someone does you the honor of criticizing your argument. I think it's worth considering. And Alex Malpass is a he's a fellow Brit philosopher who he's certainly an atheist, but interestingly, he doesn't seem to be a naturalist, or at least not a materialist naturalist. And I had actually a conversation with him, which any viewers can go look for, and it was I thought a very fruitful discussion where he pretty much conceded that if you're a materialist, you've got big problems when it comes to the laws of logic and propositions in general. But he wrote an article, I think it was published 2020, where he raised three objections to the argument. The first had to do with the concept of necessity. He suggested that we weren't clear. I should say, by the way, that the article that we're talking about was co-authored. It wasn't just my work. It was co-authored by a friend and colleague of mine by the name of Greg Welty, who actually has done far more work on this than I have. His doctoral thesis at Oxford was a defense of divine conceptualism, the idea that propositions are divine thoughts, and actually he dealt with possible worlds as well, but we can leave that aside. Just want to give him credit for doing a lot of the heavy lifting in this argument. But anyway, so Malpass's first criticism is that we weren't clear on the concept of necessity, and I think that can be easily cleared up, so I don't think that's a big issue. The second one had to do with the way we made the argument for propositions being thoughts, and he had suggested that some of the appeals that we made to about the literature of intentionality being the mark of the mental, that we hadn't represented it fairly, and that there was some lack of clarity or precision when it came to that important stage of arguing that propositions are thoughts or mental in nature. I think that can be addressed as well. The most interesting part of his objection was the third one, where he sets up a dilemma, and it's a little hard to get a handle on this, but basically he goes on the attack against divine conceptualism as such, and he argues that if propositions are divine thoughts, as we claim that they are, then we have to say that these divine thoughts have some sort of content. Okay, they have to be about things. When God thinks about something, that there's some content to that thought, and that thought is going to be a kind of propositional content. But he argues that in principle, a divine thought can't be its own content. There's something incoherent about a divine thought being its own content or containing itself in some way. And if that's the case, then either we, the divine conceptualists, have to say that divine thoughts don't actually have any content, which seems problematic, or that divine thoughts have some content distinct from themselves. There's some other entity that's playing the role of this divine content, which is either going to lead us to a kind of infinite regress, where if that content is another divine thought, then it goes on and on and on. So one divine thought has another divine thought as its content, and so on. You never actually get to the content. Or you have to sort of fall back on some sort of Platonist scheme where the propositional content of these divine thoughts is just some abstract external Platonic entity, all right? And the Platonists win the day. So he sets up this dilemma. Okay, once you say that a divine thought can't be its own content, then either the divine thought has no content, that doesn't seem like a good option, or the divine thought has some content that's distinct from itself, some other entity. And as it happens, I just wrote a blog post responding to that, literally posted it yesterday, I think.
Oh,
it was good.
How
timing.
Fortuitous. Yeah,
it is. And I didn't anticipate, I didn't write it because of this show, but because it's sort of been kicked around ever since Alex's paper came out and we had our discussion. There's been sort of questions, well, how would you respond to this? So I wrote something up. So if someone wants a far more thoughtful and articulate answer, they can go look at my
blog.
I'll
be sure to link it
afterwards.
But
the thrust of the answer is that there's a confusion there in the idea that divine thoughts have content. If divine thoughts just are propositions, or really what we should say is if propositions are divine thoughts, what that means is that divine thoughts provide the propositional content for human thoughts. Okay, so in the case of a human thought, you actually do have to distinguish between the thought and its content. Take, for example, the thought that 2 + 2 = 4, right? So I have that thought, you have that thought. We are sharing content, okay? What that means is that content has to be distinct from our thoughts, because any number of humans could have the same thought. I mean, we would have our own thoughts, but they would be the same thought in the sense that they have the same content. So we want to make a distinction between the thought and the content when it comes to human thoughts. But when it comes to divine thoughts, we actually don't accept that there's a distinction between the thought and the content itself. The thought is itself propositional content. And what I argue in this post is that anyone who accepts the existence of propositions, regardless of how they think of them as Platonic entities or as human thoughts, anyone who accepts the existence of propositions has to say that the content of the proposition is really just the proposition itself. The proposition is itself content.
Right.
And so if we're right that divine thought, the propositions are divine thoughts, then there's a sense in which divine thoughts just are content. They are propositional content. They don't have some inner entity that is their propositional content. So there's a disanalogy there between divine thoughts and human thoughts. But of course, that's exactly what you'd expect if God is the ground of truth. You know,
right.
Of course, God's thoughts are going to be different than human thoughts in some very, very significant ways, and they would have to be to do the job,
do the work. Yeah, that seems right to me. And again, just trying to be bridge builder between the old and the new. That seems to map on again really well with the scholastic understanding. Well, first off, they're committed to divine simplicity, right? So God's act and object of understanding are actually somehow identical, right? And God only has one thought. Many would say non-propositional, this perfect divine intuition, right? And sort of embedded in that is everything that sort of flows out, right? So that seems to be a nice bridge there. And also they would distinguish between material signs and formal signs as well in the scholastic tradition, I think, which would help provide some resources. So I kind of like how your argument and some of these objections in the way that it's either built or clarified, as you said at the beginning, kind of maybe point back to some insights that maybe we've just forgotten about in our
certainly. I think all the roots of this are found in Augustine and Augustine's sort of Christianizing of Platonism by taking the forms and making them divine ideas. Now Aquinas, of course, is a good Augustinian in many ways, and so it's not surprising that we can see some continuity there. Speaking for myself, I'm not a Thomist, so I have to confess that I'm not committed to that kind of scholastic metaphysics, but it doesn't mean that the kind of argument that I'm offering could not be appropriated by someone who's committed to that. And actually, and you're probably aware of this, although maybe our listeners aren't, maybe familiar with the Thomist philosopher Edward Feser. So Edward Feser's a sort of contemporary Thomist philosopher. And in his book, Five Arguments for God's Existence, he sort of gives a presentation of a number of scholastic or ancient arguments for the existence of God, but brings them up to date. But one of them, I think he calls it the Augustinian argument.
That would be it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's basically a conceptualist argument. And he does some things that Welty and I don't do. But I guess what that shows is that this kind of conceptualist argument isn't unfriendly towards those who want to take that scholastic
and he does say in that chapter that he does think that the scholastic realism that he's developing, which is supposed to be this middle ground between a moderate realism and an extreme realism, right, seems to align or play nicely with the theistic conceptual realism. I think he's got a footnote to at least Welty. I'm not.
He does. You're right. He footnotes Welty there. So yeah.
Yeah. So very cool. Yeah. And yeah, whatever differences, it's just cool to see how they're compatible in certain ways as well. All right. So do we have time for a question, Dr. Anderson? Sure. Or is there anything else with the argument in general, or any other objections that came in that you think are just important to get out there?
I don't think so. I mean, there have been other criticisms. Some I think are pretty superficial. Some of the conversations that I've had with people, it's been hard to even get them to actually grasp the argument itself, because it takes a little bit of work and a little bit of philosophical competence to understand some of these discussions about the metaphysics of propositions. There are other criticisms, but I don't want to take up our time if people have questions about what we've already discussed.
Yeah, good. Here's one. This comes from ND Irish. He wants to know, if God chose not to create, would the laws of logic still exist? So how does your argument give us some ways to think about this? Yeah.
Right. The answer is yes, because if the laws of logic are, as we've argued, divine thoughts, then they are thoughts that God has necessarily. So the thoughts that God necessarily has are thoughts that God would have in any possible world, including worlds in which God chose not to create. So there's a very important sense in which even if God had created nothing, the law of non-contradiction would still be true. And in a sense, that's what we want to say. We don't want to say that had God not created, then there would have been no laws of logic and anything goes. Certainly classical theism has always held that God is a logically consistent being. God isn't subject to the laws of logic, but neither does God transcend the laws of logic in that he's just free to be something and also not be that thing in the same place. And the right middle way then is to say that logic is in essence a characteristic of God's very being.
Yeah. So I want to, and I think that's right. And again, consistent with how scholastics have thought about it, right? You have this is the last thing I'd like to touch on. This has been really good and fun, and maybe we could have a follow-up on this if people have other questions or stuff in the future. You've written on a lot, so it'd be a lot of fun things to explore with you. But here's something I actually have not thought about a whole lot for any particular reason, and that's the idea of, or I guess the school of presupposition or apologetics. And you have a note in your paper where you make the suggestion that, hey, if this argument is correct, then any argument either for God or even against God is on some level presupposing God. I guess like maybe convince me that of presuppositionalism, because it's something I've never had a dog in that fight. Obviously, I think that God is the necessary condition for knowledge. Obviously, right? Because God's a necessary condition for the world, right? I mean, all the traditional arguments for God are essentially like, look, if no God, no world, world therefore God, right? So like that has to be true because knowledge is in the world, right? So if no God, there would be no world, right? But is the assumption of God a sort of necessary precondition of knowledge? Do you see what I'm saying? Help me think through this, because this is not presuppositional is not something I've honestly ever spent a lot of time on. But you clearly have. So
I'll try and boil things down. But presuppositionalism is, well, most directly a particular approach to Christian apologetics that was formulated really within the Reformed Protestant tradition and is particularly attributed to a guy called Cornelius Van Til, but it's been developed in different ways. And
are you in that camp, by the way? Would you consider yourself a presupposition?
Card-carrying presuppositionalist.
Got the card
as
right
long as
here.
I get to define that, because of course there's a lot of misconceptions about what presuppositionalist is.
Well, good. If you don't mind, then define everyone, because I'm sure we're going to have a lot of people on this channel who already they're either very for, very against, or like me and haven't really considered it that much. So give your presentation. Yeah.
Okay. I would say that there are two sort of driving principles of presuppositionalism. One is that there's no neutrality, there's no neutral position that you can take with respect to any evidence or proposition or argumentation. In other words, everyone has a worldview. Everyone has a set of presuppositions that they always bring to argumentation, to debate, to evidence. And the other principle is what I would call the no autonomy principle, that human reason isn't autonomous. It isn't a free-floating, self-justifying standard of truth. That is to say that the human mind is not the ultimate standard of what is true and rational, but we should submit ourselves to a higher authority, namely the revelation of God. So presupposition in general is really driven by these convictions that there's no neutrality in epistemology and also no autonomy in our epistemology. But where it's really focused is on how we argue for God's existence. And the idea is that you don't start from some supposedly religiously neutral ground of assumptions that are somehow independent of a Christian worldview or independent of any worldview for that matter. That there's no worldview neutral starting point for argumentation. But instead, the way to argue is to show that the Christian worldview can account for all of the things that we take for granted, including our ability to reason itself, our ability to make arguments, our ability to think rationally in a way that non-Christian worldviews cannot. Now, that's a summary. Of course, there's a lot of details to work out there. But the core conviction of presuppositionalism is that the Christian worldview can account for the presuppositions of rational thought itself in a way that non-Christian worldviews can't.
And you're saying Christian specifically, not just theism?
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
So not just some generic theism. So Van Til in particular thought that the doctrine of the Trinity had important epistemological implications, which take us into some pretty deep waters to do with the problem of the one and the many and how we relate universals to particulars. But yeah, a presuppositionalist does have a presuppositionalist would have a conviction that it's not just a generic theism, but certain distinctive elements of Christian theism are part of this worldview that is needed to make sense of human experience in general, and particular our ability to reason.
Yeah.
Now, how we connect that with the argument from logic is, of course, in order to argue, in order to reason, we need laws of logic. And so what this argument seeks to do is to show that logical argumentation presupposes the existence of God. What that means is that even the arguments that atheists use, even when an atheist argues against the existence of God, by using the laws of logic, he's tacitly depending upon the existence of God. And that's the sort of dynamic that a presuppositionalist wants to exploit, to say, in order to argue against the existence of God, you actually have to presuppose the existence of God. But the question is, presuppose in what way?
Yes.
Is it a metaphysical presupposition, or is it an epistemological presupposition? And I think there's been some difference of opinion among presuppositionalists on this. Is it that the atheist actually, unless he consciously presupposes the existence of God and some mental state, he can't reason? I think that's too strong a claim.
That's the one that I would be skeptical
right.
of. Right.
And that's often been assumed that presuppositions are all saying that. I think that the more modest claim it should be our starting point, that in an objective sense, the atheist is depending on the existence of God. That at the level of metaphysical precondition, the atheist is depending on the existence of God in order to reason. It may be possible to go further and argue that there are certain sort of grounding assumptions that need to be in place, or that once you introduce atheistic presuppositions into your belief system, they have a kind of deleterious effect in providing defeaters for certain ordinary beliefs that you have. Alvin Plantinga has done a bit of this. You may be aware with this evolutionary argument against naturalism, that once you think through the implications of naturalism, it actually gives you a defeater for the trust in your own cognitive faculties.
Right.
And so I think that's a direction that's definitely worth exploring, and some presuppositionalists have done that.
Yeah, so let me ask you this then, and this is, again, as somebody who's not spent much time. I'm very familiar with Plantinga, but not the broader school of presuppositionalism. So yeah, that stronger claim is the one that immediately struck me as suspicious. Maybe it's true, but it didn't strike me as obviously true. So then the role of natural theology then. What do you think that still serves a legitimate role to get to? Like, do you need natural theology to bear out the presuppositionalist position? Is what I'm saying. Or
that's a vexed question.
Because I know some Reformed epistemologists think, like, what a Reformed epistemology is saying is that we engage in a sort of implicit natural theology, right?
Well, we would want to distinguish between Reformed epistemology, that movement that was sort of spearheaded by Plantinga,
they're different.
And the presuppositionalist movement that's attributed to Van Til. So the Reformed epistemologists, their beef is you don't need natural theology. Right. Because belief in God is a properly basic belief. It's produced by the sensus divinitatis, and it's fun to make arguments for God's existence, and they serve some use. They're not strictly necessary.
You don't need it for warrant, right?
Right, exactly. Whereas the presuppositionists, and certainly Van Til was critical of. He said a lot of negative things about natural theology, but he's thinking of it rather narrowly in terms of. Particularly the Thomistic tradition that he thinks has been has compromised certain principles by a synthesis with Aristotelian metaphysics, and that's a big issue. Take a lot of time to debate. But Van Til expressed a certain skepticism about natural theology conceived it along fairly traditional lines. But elsewhere, Van Til says that there's a good kind of natural theology, and basically it's a natural theology that properly recognizes both general revelation and special revelation, and that we're not autonomous beings and our reason isn't autonomous. And this kind of presuppositional argument that you need a Christian worldview to account for some of the basic intellectual activities that we engage in a sense, that's a kind of natural theology. Certainly, and if natural theology encompasses any argument for God's existence, then it encompasses presuppositional arguments. But perhaps the way in which they are deployed and the underlying assumptions that drive that kind of argumentation are rather different from those that you would find in the Thomistic tradition.
Yeah, well, I guess, yeah, that's interesting, because I mean, there's different schools here, and I'm very sympathetic with Reformed epistemology and Plantinga's project. But Eleanor Stump, when she reads Aquinas, she actually thinks that Aquinas is closer to Plantinga in epistemology than a foundationalist. So even Thomists are somewhat divided on this.
And Plantinga himself, in his later work, calls it what he calls the Aquinas-Calvin model. Right. It's not often that you see Aquinas and Calvin coupled quite in that way.
They're finally friends, yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, Plantinga himself says you can find some of these elements in Aquinas, but of course, because when people hear Aquinas, they always think immediately of the 5 ways. They think of these as being somehow what provides the basic warrant for belief in God, and I don't think that's how Aquinas.
No, that definitely can't be a right way of reading Aquinas. So, like, you need to understand and be able to articulate the 5 ways to be warranted in belief in God. Right. That's definitely not the case, right? At least I would not accept that. I also don't think that's what Aquinas is saying either.
No, I don't think so either.
Yeah, very interesting. Okay, you've got me thinking a lot about this. Maybe we'll have to do a follow-up on this particular topic, because in fact, it's been requested on this channel a number of times, and my sort of superficial reading of it, would want to reject that stronger position that you put out, or at least I need to hear a lot more in favor of it. But where you went from there seems certainly plausible.
The thing to recognize is that presuppositionalism has its variations, like any movement.
Sure.
I mean, Thomism isn't homogeneous.
It isn't Garrigou or Lagrange.
Right. You've got your neo-Thomists. So and the same with presuppositionalism. And so if we're going to have these discussions, you've got to be a little precise. Well, exactly what is the claim in question that we're disputing here? Yeah,
and that's why I thank you for articulating exactly what it is that you hold to that. Do you have time for one more quick question here, Dr. Anderson?
Go ahead.
All right, Octa says there are some modern logicians who question the law of non-contradiction, the law of excluded middle. Does that pose a challenge to your argument? You actually do address this in your paper. Yeah,
I do.
The non-classical forms of logic.
So I love these questions that tee up answers that I've already given. So yeah, in the paper, we begin by talking about the laws of logic, and we say, you can take the classical laws of logic, the law of non-contradiction, law of excluded middle, law of identity. These are typically taken as being the core. Aristotle himself identified them, and so we'll use these as our examples of laws of logic. But yes, in modern logic, there is what's called non-classical, paraconsistent, subclassical. They're different terms that reject one or more of these classical laws of logic, and in particular, the law of non-contradiction. So there are some logics, modern logics, that allow for contradictions. Now, that would have horrified the scholastics, because they would have thought that they argued that anything follows from a contradiction. So you get this problem of what's called logical explosion. But actually, modern logicians have shown that you can put other constraints in place that prevent this kind of logical collapse. So there are forms of logic that don't accept the law of non-contradiction. There are also forms of logic that don't accept the law of excluded middle, that any proposition must be either true or false. They could have no truth value, for example. Is this a problem for our argument? No, because even non-classical logicians accept that there are some laws of logic, and some of those laws of logic have to be understood as necessary truths. So as long as whoever I'm speaking to recognizes that there are some laws of logic, and that some of these laws of logic are necessarily true.
Right. Even
and
if we don't
actually,
agree on what they are, you
exactly.
can just recast your
Even
argument.
if we don't
yeah.
agree, it's kind of like
Because I'm fully on board with the classical position when it comes to logic. Yeah, I think those various paradoxes can all be resolved in different ways. Yeah.
Yeah, it would take a lot. It would take a lot for me to accept a paraconsistent logic. But I respect those who do that. It's not a crazy position. I think it's wrong. I'm not persuaded. But it's a live option that's seriously discussed today. But fortunately, this argument from logic is immune to that, because all you need is one necessary truth to get the argument started.
Right. And it's important to understand that the people who are pushing these other positions, they are committed to that.
That's right. Yeah.
Right. They're not saying that there are no laws of logic or necessary truths, right? Because then you're just gonna, what was Aristotle say? If you do that, all you could do is just wiggle your finger, right?
Right. Yeah. Of course, if you think there are no laws of logic, then you can't argue for that position, because arguments require laws of logic.
Yeah. Very, very, very good. Fascinating discussion, Dr. Anderson. Really enjoyed it. And you've got me thinking about a lot of different things and a lot of different directions, which tells me this is this has been a really fruitful conversation. So before we go, any new projects you're working on you want to mention? And also please tell us about your website and blog where people can find some of your further thoughts there.
So I have a website, and I blog very intermittently. I sort of have bursts of activity, and then I'll be silent for 6 months. But the blog is called Analogical Thoughts, which has to do with Van Til and his influence on me. But the URL is proginosko.com. There's a story behind that, but it's proginosko.com. That's sort of one-stop shop for my writings, formal, informal, some videos, lectures, and so forth. So that would be the place to go. Don't have any particular writing projects in the pot right now. The last thing I published was a book on David Hume, in a series about great thinkers. It's a sort of introduction to great thinkers from a reformed perspective. So my theological biases are obviously on display there, but some of your listeners might find that useful. But I'm actually doing some work at the moment, engaging with, since we just talked about this, a Christian philosopher by the name of J.C. Beale, who accepts subclassical logic and wrote a book last year entitled The Contradictory Christ, where he argues that Orthodox Christian Christology, basically the two natures view of Christ is one person with a divine nature and a human nature. He argues that that's a real contradiction, but it's okay. Yeah. Because once we accept paraconsistent logic or subclassical logic, we can accept contradictions, and this is a big, enormous contradiction, but there's nothing wrong with that, which is a pretty provocative position. But his area of expertise is these subclassical logics, and so he's able to field a lot of the initial objections that someone would have against that. But I've written a bit on paradox in Christian theology, which resists going down that road of accepting real contradiction.
And I am certainly in your camp on that.
Yeah.
One. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, that might be a fun one to talk about in the future as well. So I'll link all that in the show notes. I'll also try to link some of Welty's other work. He's got a nice essay. And what is that? God Overall, or Control of God. There was a volume that came out.
Beyond the Control of God.
Yeah, that was a good one. I like that one. And there's also another volume in Natural Theology, fairly recent, that he had a piece in.
Yeah, it's
they all got such generic titles, like Contemporary Arguments in Natural Theology or something like that. I'll track it down. So that way people can, because you guys have done work together.
Yeah, that'd be great if you could link to some of his stuff as well.
And then I'll link to your blog, this paper, and I'll put in Ed Fazer's there too, so people can do the compare and contrast. Awesome. Well, Dr. Anderson, thank you so much. This has been a blast.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.